For over 40 years, he was a ghost, moving silently through quiet American neighborhoods, the kind where porch lights stay on and neighbors wave without thinking twice. He learned the routines of ordinary people and used them against them. He didn't rush, he didn't panic, and he never left anything behind that could give him away. Night after night, he slipped through doors and windows as if he belonged there, watching, waiting, studying. Families went asleep believing they were safe, unaware that someone had already decided they were. He committed dozens of crimes, each one more calculated than the last, leaving entire communities shaken and afraid to turn off their lights. And then, just as suddenly as it all began, he stopped. No warning, no explanation, no arrest. He simply disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a fear that refused to fade with time. Investigators were left with fragments, pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. They had DNA collected from crime scenes, carefully preserved through the years as technology advanced. They had detailed reports from survivors who described the same patterns, the same methods, the same chilling sense that this was someone who planned everything in advance. They had evidence that proved this man existed, that he had walked through those homes, that he had stood in the dark watching his victims before making his move. But even with all of that, they had no name to attach to the face no one had clearly seen. Decades passed, detectives retired, new officers took over, and still the case remained open, hanging in the background like a question no one could answer. The world around the case changed, but the mystery stayed the same. Advances in forensic science brought hope, yet every new method seemed to lead back to the same dead end. The DNA profile was clear, precise, undeniable, but it didn't match anyone in the system. It was as if the man had never been arrested, never been processed, never given law enforcement a reason to record his identity. He had lived among ordinary people, blending into daily life so completely that even those closest to him had no reason to suspect anything. While the victims tried to rebuild their lives and communities worked to move forward, the question lingered quietly in the background. Who was he, and how had he managed to vanish so completely? Years turned into decades, and the case became something more than just an investigation. It became a symbol of unfinished justice, a reminder that even the most persistent efforts can sometimes fall short. Detectives revisited old files, re-examined evidence, and followed leads that led nowhere. Some believed the man was gone, that he had taken his secret with him and would never be identified. Others refused to accept that ending, convinced that the answer was still out there, hidden in plain sight. They understood something important, something that kept the case alive when everything else suggested it should have been closed. A mistake, no matter how small, can wait years before revealing itself. And that belief, that quiet determination, is what kept the investigation moving forward when logic said it shouldn't. Because the truth is, no matter how careful someone thinks they are, no matter how many steps they take to cover their tracks, time has a way of exposing what was meant to stay hidden. In this case, it wasn't a confession, it wasn't a witness suddenly coming forward, and it wasn't a forgotten piece of evidence sitting in a file. It was something far simpler, something no one could have imagined at the time these crimes were committed. A tool that didn't exist back then, used in a way no one had considered, became the key to unlocking a mystery that had lasted for over 4 decades. Until one day, a simple online search exposed one of the most dangerous men in American history. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. So how do you catch a killer who left no witnesses behind, who moved through homes like a shadow and vanished before anyone could fully understand what was happening? How do you identify someone who seemed to step out of thin air, commit his crimes with precision, and then disappear into a normal life without raising suspicion for decades? Investigators asked themselves these same questions over and over again, staring at the same evidence, revisiting the same reports, hoping that something, anything, would finally connect. Because this wasn't just a case that went cold, It was a case that refused to give them a single clear direction. Every detail they had only confirmed one thing. The man they were looking for was careful, disciplined, and always one step ahead. What made it even more frustrating was the fact that they weren't starting from nothing. They had something most cases from that time never had, something solid and undeniable. His DNA. A perfect genetic profile preserved from multiple crime scenes, quietly waiting for the day technology would catch up. It told them he was real, that he existed somewhere out there, living a life that didn't match the fear he had once created. But when they ran that profile through every criminal database available, the result was always the same. No match, no record, no identity. It was as if the man they were searching for had never been caught doing anything wrong in his life, as if he had managed to separate his actions from his identity in a way that seemed almost impossible. And that raised an even bigger question. If he wasn't in the system, then where was he? Was he still in California, living in the same communities he once targeted? Had he moved across the country, blending into a completely different environment where no one knew his past? Or was he someone people saw every day without a second thought, someone who looked so ordinary that suspicion never even crossed their minds? The idea that he could be hiding in plain sight wasn't just unsettling, it changed the way investigators approached the case. Because if he had managed to avoid detection for that long, it meant he understood something most criminals didn't. He understood patience, he understood routine, and most importantly, he understood how to leave just enough behind to remind people he was there, but never enough to give himself away. But even the most careful plans can only hold up for so long. Over time, small details begin to matter, patterns begin to form, and sometimes the breakthrough doesn't come from where you expect it. In this case, it didn't come from a witness stepping forward or a sudden confession. It came from something completely unrelated to the crimes themselves, something designed for an entirely different purpose. A piece of technology that had nothing to do with law enforcement, nothing to do with criminal investigations, and yet somehow became the missing link. The same evidence that had sat untouched for years suddenly had a new purpose, a new way of being understood. And when investigators realized what they could do with it, everything changed. Because this wasn't about finding him directly anymore. It was about finding the people connected to him, people who had no idea they were part of this story. It was about tracing a path backward, following a line that stretched across generations, quietly linking one person to another until it reached someone who matched everything they had been searching for. And as that process began, as names started to appear and connections became clearer, one thing became impossible to ignore. The answer had been there all along, just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. It started quietly in the mid-1970s, in neighborhoods that looked like any other across America, the kind where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. In Visalia, the first signs were easy to overlook. A missing item here, a door left slightly open there, small details that didn't immediately point to something larger. People assumed it was coincidence, maybe carelessness, maybe a one-off incident that wouldn't happen again. But then it did happen again, and again. Each time just subtle enough to avoid panic, but consistent enough to leave a quiet unease in the air. It didn't take long before that unease turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore, as residents began to realize that these weren't isolated events. Someone was moving through their neighborhoods with intention, learning their habits without ever being seen. By the time the pattern reached Sacramento, the feeling had changed completely. This wasn't about missing items anymore. It was about presence. People began locking their doors earlier, checking their windows more carefully, listening for sounds that they might have once ignored. And still, it didn't stop. The intruder adapted, shifting his approach, becoming more confident with each passing incident. Victims would later describe something they couldn't fully explain at the time, a sense that someone had been watching them long before they even realized it. Not just passing through, not just acting on impulse, but studying, observing, waiting for the exact right moment. It created a kind of fear that lingered long after the night was over, because it meant the danger didn't begin with the break-in, It began much earlier. What made it even more unsettling was how calculated everything seemed. He didn't rush. He didn't leave chaos behind. He moved with purpose, choosing his targets carefully, learning the layout of homes, understanding routines in a way that suggested preparation rather than chance. He wasn't impulsive. He was patient, methodical, calculating. And that distinction changed everything because it meant this wasn't someone reacting in the moment. This was someone who planned, someone who thought ahead, someone who understood exactly what he was doing and how to avoid being caught. With every new incident, the pattern became clearer, and so did the realization that this wasn't going to stop on its own. As the months passed, the incidents escalated, not just in frequency but in intensity, pushing the fear beyond individual homes and into entire communities. Neighbors began warning each other, families changed their routines, and law enforcement started to see the bigger picture forming in front of them. Reports that once seemed unrelated were now being connected, revealing a single individual behind it all. But even with that understanding, there was still a distance between knowing what was happening and knowing who was responsible. He remained unidentified, moving through different areas, adapting his methods, always staying just out of reach. The more they learned about him, the more they realized how difficult it would be to stop him. Over time, as the crimes continued and spread across California, the man behind them began to take on different identities, different names given by investigators trying to make sense of what they were dealing with. At first, he was linked to a series of break-ins in Visalia, then later to a wave of attacks in the eastern parts of Sacramento. Each phase of his activity seemed connected, yet slightly different, as if he was evolving, refining his approach as he went. Eventually, those separate identities began to merge into one, forming a clearer picture of a single individual responsible for years of fear and uncertainty. He became known as the East Area Rapist, then later the original Night Stalker, and finally, the name that would define the entire case, the Golden State Killer. He struck at night, when the neighborhoods in Sacramento had gone quiet and the routines of everyday life had settled into silence. Houses that felt secure during the day became vulnerable in ways no one had considered, and he understood that better than anyone. He entered homes while families slept, moving carefully, deliberately, avoiding anything that could alert his presence. There was no randomness in the way he operated. He knew the layouts before he stepped inside, knew which doors were likely to be unlocked, which paths gave him the quickest exit, and which moments offered the least resistance. It wasn't just about getting in and out. It was about control, about knowing that every movement had been thought through long before the night began. What made it even more unsettling was how consistent his pattern became. The same timing, the same approach, the same level of precision repeated across different locations, connecting incidents that might have otherwise seemed unrelated. Investigators began mapping the details, comparing reports, trying to find something that would break the pattern and reveal a mistake. But the pattern held. He adapted when necessary, changed small details just enough to stay ahead, but never in a way that exposed him. And each time he left behind just enough evidence to confirm it was him, but never enough to identify who he was. It created a frustrating balance, one where they knew they were dealing with the same individual, yet remained no closer to finding him. Victims described something that stayed with investigators long after the reports were filed. It wasn't just fear of what had happened, it was the realization of what might have happened before. Many believed he had been watching them, studying their habits, learning their routines in the days or even weeks leading up to the moment he chose to act. It felt like he had been there before, unnoticed, blending into the background, gathering information without ever revealing himself. That idea changed everything, because it meant the crimes didn't begin at night. They began much earlier, in ways no one could easily detect or prevent. As the incident spread beyond Sacramento and reached other parts of California, the same method followed, reinforcing the belief that this was someone who understood not just how to commit the act, but how to avoid capture afterward. He left quickly, disappeared into the darkness, and by the time anyone could respond, he was already gone. Patrols increased, warnings were issued, and communities became more alert, but none of it seemed to slow him down. If anything, it forced him to become more careful, more precise, refining his approach with each new incident. Investigators worked tirelessly, narrowing down possibilities, following leads that seemed promising, only to watch them fall apart under closer examination. There were moments when it felt like they were getting closer, when a detail stood out or a lead suggested they were finally moving in the right direction. But each time that progress slipped away, leaving them back where they started. And then, just as the pressure seemed to be building, just as it felt like the gap between what they knew and what they needed to know was finally closing, everything stopped. The reports slowed, then ended, and the pattern that had once been so consistent suddenly broke. And just when investigators thought they were closing in, he disappeared. Years passed. The neighborhoods in Sacramento and beyond slowly returned to something that looked like normal life, but the case never truly faded. Files were stored, reopened, reviewed, and passed from one set of investigators to another, each generation inheriting the same unanswered questions. Leads that once seemed promising lost momentum, witnesses moved on, memories became less reliable, and the trail that once felt active grew colder with time. But one thing remained, untouched by time and immune to fading memory: DNA. It sat quietly in evidence storage, collected from multiple scenes, preserved with the understanding that one day it might hold the answer everyone had been searching for. For many investigators, that was enough reason not to let the case go. Even as years turned into decades, there were those who refused to accept that the Golden State Killer would remain unidentified. Cold case units began to take a closer look, revisiting every detail with fresh eyes, applying new techniques that hadn't existed when the crimes were first committed. They studied patterns again, reanalyzed timelines, and most importantly, they returned to the DNA, treating it not as a dead end, but as the one piece of evidence that still had something left to offer. It became the center of the investigation, the one constant in a case where everything else had changed. But the frustration never really went away. They had the killer's genetic fingerprint, a clear and precise profile that proved he existed somewhere, living a life that didn't reflect the fear he had once created. Yet every time they ran it through official databases, the result was the same: no match, no record, no identity. It was a contradiction that made the case even more difficult to solve. How could someone leave behind such definitive evidence and still remain completely unknown? It suggested something unsettling, that the man they were looking for had managed to avoid the system entirely, never giving law enforcement a reason to record his DNA in the first place. That realization forced investigators to think differently. If he wasn't in the system, then maybe they were looking in the wrong place. Maybe the answer wasn't in criminal databases at all. That idea led to a shift in approach, one that didn't rely on finding him directly, but instead focused on finding people connected to him. Around this time, a new kind of technology had begun to grow in popularity, something designed for everyday people curious about their ancestry, not for solving crimes. Genealogy databases allowed individuals to upload their DNA and trace family connections, building networks that stretched across generations. At first, it had nothing to do with law enforcement. It was simply a tool for understanding where you came from. But to investigators working on a case like this, it represented something entirely different: a possibility, a new way of thinking about identification, one that didn't depend on whether the suspect had ever been arrested or entered into a database. Instead, it relied on the idea that even if he had never been recorded, someone related to him might have been. And if that connection could be found, it could lead them closer than they had ever been before. Then came an idea, one that would change everything. Instead of searching criminal databases, investigators made a decision that shifted the entire direction of the case. They took the DNA that had been sitting in evidence for decades and uploaded it to a public genealogy website, the same kind of platform ordinary people used to learn about their ancestry and connect with distant relatives. The goal wasn't to find him directly, because they already knew that approach had failed. The goal was to find someone connected to him, someone who had unknowingly left a trace that could be followed. It was a different kind of search, one that required patience, precision, and a willingness to explore connections that stretched far beyond the immediate case. At first, the results didn't point to a clear answer. What appeared were distant matches, individuals who shared small portions of DNA, enough to suggest a relationship but not enough to identify anyone directly. For many cases, that might have been another dead end. But this time, investigators took a different approach. They began building family trees, tracing lines across generations, connecting names, dates, and relationships in a way that slowly narrowed the possibilities. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't simple, but with each step, the picture became clearer. Each connection removed another layer of uncertainty, bringing them closer to someone who fit the profile they had been working with for years. And that's when a match appeared. Not a direct identification, not a name that immediately solved the case, but something just as powerful. A distant family connection that aligned with the DNA they had been analyzing. It was the first real breakthrough in decades, the first indication that they were finally moving in the right direction. From there, the process became more focused. Investigators followed the family lines forward, narrowing their search based on age, location, and circumstances that matched the timeline of the crimes. The pool of possibilities grew smaller, more specific, until eventually it led them to one man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. On the surface, there was nothing that immediately set him apart. He had lived a life that appeared ordinary, blending into the same kind of communities he had once targeted. But as investigators took a closer look, the details began to align. His age matched the timeline. His history placed him in the right locations. And most importantly, he had never been required to submit his DNA to any criminal database, which explained why he had remained invisible for so long. To confirm what they suspected, they needed something definitive. They obtained a sample of his DNA, collected quietly without alerting him to what was happening. When that sample was tested against the evidence from the crime scenes, the result was undeniable. After more than 4 decades, the mystery that had haunted investigators, victims, and entire communities finally had an answer. In 2018, after years of waiting, searching, and refusing to give up, they finally had him. What do you think about the way this case was solved? Should this kind of technology be used more often to bring long unsolved crimes to justice? Or does it raise questions about privacy and how far we are willing to go to catch someone? Could Joseph James DeAngelo have remained hidden if these tools hadn't existed? Or was it inevitable that time would eventually reveal the truth? Let me know your thoughts below, because every perspective matters in a story that has fascinated people for decades. And if you found this story about the Golden State Killer fascinating, there are many more cases just like this, filled with mystery, perseverance, and unexpected breakthroughs, waiting to be uncovered.